Okay, hello. I just want to say first, thank you, Amber Stout, for joining us for our NextGen Talks. Just a brief introduction of myself and my colleague. I'm Courtnie Thomas. I'm the Mental Health Policy Advisor at NextGen Policy. And how we like to have these NextGen Talks is bring in an expert within their field to talk about the correlation and intersection of a specific policy issue along with mental health. I'm joined by my colleague, Tiffany Germain, as well as Amber Stout. So please go forward and introduce yourself, and we'll start this process.
Great. Thanks, Courtney. I'm Tiffany Germain. I'm a research and policy advisor, and I've been working at NextGen the past 2 years to ensure that every Californian has access to healthy, nutritious food. And I've done that by supporting legislation in the legislature that addresses issues such as food hunger and food deserts and providing healthy school meals for every child. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion today.
And I'm Amber Stott. I'm the founder and chief food genius at the nonprofit Food Literacy Center, where our mission is to inspire kids to eat their vegetables. And right now during COVID, we are working alongside school lunch distribution in elementary schools, and we are passing out kits that have healthy food, healthy ingredients to make recipes for a family of 4.
That is amazing. That is amazing. I always like to start these conversations with just like a general check-in with everybody. So, just how are you doing today? How are we feeling today? I'll start and just it's interesting to still be working from home. I have a 9-year-old that is distant learning still. And for me, we use food as a way to keep in connection with our families. We do Zoom family dinners and we share recipes. And it's really been interesting to see how my son is using food as a way to express himself. We're watching shows and learning new recipes. And it's really been interesting to kind of see his passion and love for food grow, particularly during such a, the buzzword of the past year, unprecedented time. So that's how I'm doing today. I'm grateful and thankful that we're having this conversation about food and food resources as well as mental health.
I'm doing pretty good today. I, have spent a lot of time thinking about how grateful I am to have the resources that I do and to be protected during this time. It's just, as Courtney said, unprecedented, and it has been a really tough year, but I'm feeling very hopeful lately about the vaccine distribution. I know my parents have gotten at least the first vaccine, so a lot of people are moving forward, and I'm looking forward to that time where we can all gather again and have a nice dinner together.
Today, I'm grateful to be talking with you guys. I think one of the nice things about the technology that has come to play in COVID times is being able to talk to people in other cities and, with colleagues that are doing this work, not just locally, but statewide and nationally in a way that is more accessible because we don't have to hop on planes with our nonprofit budgets. So yeah, it's really nice to be able to continue. I think for me, I have found during the pandemic that the female leadership has really risen to the top. And I have found that those are the people who are really creating solutions and meeting the challenge head on with bravery and a lack of fear. And so, yeah, it's really cool to be talking to you guys and sharing in this work together. And I also feel hopeful because I think there are a lot of brilliant minds that with compassionate hearts that are addressing these issues. And I think we're going to come out stronger for it.
Yeah, it's definitely, I tell my son as often, more probably than he'd like to hear, just like we have to find a silver lining and feel something to be appreciative and grateful for, and recognizing all the work that people are in to really kind of dig down and see how we can learn and grow from the past year and a half can be inspiring. Amber, you briefly kind of gave us like a rundown of like who you are and whatnot, but I'd like to take just a quick moment before we get into the meat of our conversation. Tell us how you got involved in the food insecurity and food in schools community. What was maybe the impetus of that, and how did you find and found the organization, and just give us a little like insight into how that started for you?
Sure. I mean, it's years of work that sort of culminated in this happening. In about 2008, I started devouring books about our food system. It started with Jane Goodall's Harvest for Hope, and it unpacked for me all of the multiple issues that are bound up in our food system. I have only ever worked in nonprofit. My whole career, 2 decades, has been in nonprofit. I've worked in issues of violence prevention. I've worked with microfinance globally around the world. I've worked with homelessness, and all of these issues are wrapped up in our food. And as I began to read, I also find that for me, food is joy. And what if, having already served a decade working in these kinds of nonprofits, it's hard. It's very hard working in a nonprofit. It is mentally draining. You carry the weight of the folks you serve with you everywhere. And at the time, the food movement was really about organic and farmers markets. And I found it was not addressing or meeting the needs of the people that I was serving in the other nonprofits where I worked. And that divide bothered me. And I thought, what if we can use food as this sort of joyful pathway to address many of these other larger social determinants of health and these other, environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, all of these issues that are packed into something as simple as carrots. And how can I make that accessible to others? So really just came from, this fire that was burning in me to need to do something about it. I call myself a woman of action. I don't like to just sit around and be mad about something. I needed to do something about it. And I started interviewing other nonprofits around town and realized that this was a gap. Educating kids about eating their vegetables was a gap, and that indeed it would be a useful gap to fill. Because, for example, when I talked to folks at the food bank, they said, well, we have all this beautiful food. We're in the farm to fork capital of America. We have all this great produce that we have access to, but people don't necessarily know what it is or how to cook with it. And so that was the gap. I was like, okay, I know how to cook and I love kids. I am a giant child. So let's start there. And it is an idea that clearly was the right idea at the right time, and it has continued to flourish. And so here we are almost a decade later, and reaching 12 schools in our district and building a cooking school. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
You have such an engaging way of connecting with people as well. I know a couple of years ago, some of my colleagues and I attended your Veggie of the Year event, where you were getting kids excited about eating different kinds of vegetables by bringing in chefs. And it really stuck with all of us about how they were excited about it, and then they can incorporate that into their regular eating habits. So we just really were excited after we left that event and just felt very full of joy.
One of my favorite events of the year, right? And even in COVID, we still ran that event, even though the kids and the chefs couldn't be together, because it just brings everybody such joy to, vote on a vegetable of the year, especially during this election year. That was a great vote to cast.
Yeah. I bet. Well, speaking of COVID, I'd love to hear a little bit about like how you've had to, address what's happening, and, children are out of school. Hunger used to be such a huge crisis across our state even before the pandemic, and now it has exploded to new levels. There's people waiting in lines at food banks. Schools have become a huge resource for food. I just wanted to see if maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're experiencing or what we've seen kids experiencing on the ground and how you've had to adapt.
I think one of my favorite things that has changed and come out of this crisis is that perception and understanding of school lunch. Food Literacy Center has partnered with our school lunch program from the beginning. And, when I was first starting, there were still TV shows where folks would sort of take food lunch to task, school lunch to task, and shame them for what they were doing. But school lunch has always been about feeding our children who are food and nutrition insecure. And particularly in California, I feel that our school lunch programs have done an amazing job. And they were the first ones, the minute schools closed, they never went home. They continued working. And so their heroism is now on public display in a way that it never was before and always deserved. So I'm very, very grateful for that. They're the first ones who called me. Our nutrition services director, so basically the head school lunch lady, is the first person who called me and said, what can we do to get you out there? And I was so grateful for that call because, we're a hands-on cooking and nutrition program. And I thought, our work just disappeared when they closed schools. And I have got to pivot to be able to continue to reach these kids. We saw the lines, right? We heard the stories. We had school social workers and principals calling us saying, we just had to close the gates because the lines were so long and we ran out of school lunches. How else can Food Literacy Center help? And so without that partnership with school lunch, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So basically what we've done, school lunch sets up and they distribute their school meals. So they'll have a tent, like say right here, and then we'll have a tent right here. So because people are already showing up for school lunch, and that's going to be oftentimes like a meal they can eat right then and there, although that also is changing. They're also now getting like bags of potatoes and pineapples and all kinds of great stuff that they can cook with later. So ours is a recipe kit that is filled with ingredients that they take home and cook later. So that partnership has been really critical. I just can't say enough good things about the folks working in the school meal program because they really, they care, and that's why they're out there day to day. So yeah, we're grateful to partner with them.
It's been so encouraging to see people on the ground taking action, always looking for the helpers, and that school lunches, work with you and other nonprofit groups and food banks have come together to make kind of a one-stop area. And I hope that there are some lessons that we can take away from this awful global pandemic, and where, we collaborate more about where the need is. And I know that we aren't reaching everybody still. So, there's still so much more work to do.
Absolutely. One of our school social workers called us and said, because the social worker's job is to call every family and find out, how's your housing, how's your food situation, how's your mental health. At one of our elementary schools, she discovered that there were several families who did not have transportation to get to the school to pick up those lunches. And so in partnership with us and some local small farms and a couple of other nonprofits, every single week since the pandemic, we have been packing up boxes of groceries, including our recipe kits, and driving them, having volunteers drive to the homes of about 39 families who otherwise would be slipping through the cracks of even the school lunch program. So yeah, it really has taken these collaborations across sectors, and we weren't necessarily working in that way with social workers in the schools before. So there's a lot of new and interesting partnerships that have formed, and it's been, good to see these happening. But what's happening in the schools where there wasn't a social worker who created a program like that, right? What's happening to the 30 families at each of the schools that can't get to the distribution?
Absolutely. So, you mentioned something that, of course, pings for me about that intersection between food insecurity and mental health. And I'd love to spend a little bit of time just kind of like, connecting those dots, because obviously this pandemic has done a number on everyone's mental well-being and behavioral health, and specifically focusing on children and youth that, aren't being able to socialize with their friends and be able to crowd around the lunch table, or to be able to like have snack time or whatnot. Do you have any type of like numbers or anything that you can share with us about how, this particular layer of food insecurity and the non being able to access food through school lunches traditionally has impacted the child's ability to learn? Like, is there anything that you can speak to about that, of how we can kind of, at a larger scale, take lessons away from this and then like have also immediate action to kind of close that gap?
There's a lot packed into that. So let's start with, I think this conversation is the conversation that needs to be had. And when we go into crisis, we tend to stop at crisis services, right? So there are hungry people, let's feed them, full stop, they're fed. And that is the setback of this pandemic that I and my colleagues in the food system it's hard to come to work every day knowing that pre-pandemic we were moving, it's like Sisyphus, right? You're moving the rock up the hill and it slid back down. I've heard statistically we've backslid 10 years of progress in meeting the need of hungry kids.
Yeah.
So imagine not just that, but all these other services that are not crisis-based, but are still necessary. And everything gets reduced to the crisis-based in times of crisis. And that's really unfortunate, because what that does is there is a chronic stress around hunger, right? Like that constant not knowing where the next meal is going to be, having to show up in lines at food banks, in lines at school food distribution, not being able to have the advocacy to be able to take money to a grocery store and buy what you want that day, right? Like that is a chronic stress. And we forget about those pieces. We forget about the fact that we have to end hunger altogether, and that we can't just keep passing out food, because you pass out food today, these same families aren't going to have another job tomorrow. They're going to be hungry again tomorrow. So we have to be doing this upstream work, but in the times of crisis, the immediate needs get stacked so high that the bandwidth of folks like us to do both meeting the crisis need and meeting these other needs of actually fixing the system and fixing the problems gets set back. And so I would agree that mental health tends to be something that we overlook and don't necessarily put at the top of that bucket, of the top of that pile. So yeah, these are really important conversations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you really talked about joy, and it's such a nebulous thing to be able to kind of engage with actively and to make the choice to be joyful and to show up, and especially in a time where so many people are going through so many inequities, and it's just folks are kind of constantly under this pressure and this tenseness. And I know that I experience you as a joyful person, but I'd love to talk about how you kind of intentionally show up with joy and how that affects your own personal mental health, as well as the folks that are around you and the children and the families that you're engaged with, and how we connect the food and the joyfulness with mental health.
And that's so important. When the crisis first started, I was really hesitant. I didn't know if it's almost like, do we have permission to still feel joy? And I was asking myself this question at the start of the pandemic, because we show up in veggie costumes and we make veggie jokes, and is a crisis a time to be doing that? And I had to remind myself that our kids were in crisis prior to the crisis, right? These are kids who do not have the same privileges. There are kids who are experiencing these ACEs, these multiple layers of chronic stress and trauma often. And it's more important in a time of crisis to have, because resilience is essentially, and it's a big word that everybody keeps using during this crisis, but resilience is the ability to sort of bounce back after hard times. And none of us are going to reach happy right now, right? That is not the goal. the goal is small moments of joy when we can bounce back just for a moment or two and be reminded that there are moments of joy, there is good in the world, and we can offer hope. It will help us to continue to, bounce a little bit forward before we fall back again, because we're going to be constantly falling back. So that joy, that's something that prior to COVID we were doing because we knew our kids needed it. And, they tell us all the time that one of their favorite things about Food Literacy Center is that we show up, right? And I think part of that is we're showing up with joy and with food, and it's choice, being able to cook for yourself, again, not just being handed a meal that somebody else cooked for you. So all of these things, we do have permission to have joy, and it's more important than ever. And so we really try to be the folks that can help provide that. And we really think food offers that. And that's why everybody's, everybody's talking about food in COVID, right? So it really is a pathway to help build these little moments. And if we can be conscious of that's what we're doing, I think it's really important.
Great. I just wanted to add on really quick. I mean, not knowing where your next meal is coming from is inherently stressful. It can be isolating from your community. It can change the way that you think about food and acquire food, and it could just, it's just not something that people think about, as you were saying, as like how it's actually impacting the person. But research has shown that like there is this connection, that people can feel isolated, sad, depressed, anxious about where that next meal is coming from. And it's something, especially like the research has shown, especially among females in general, like it's just a huge impact to their mental well-being. So I just really appreciate that you're always there to show up with joy, and that we really need to make that connection of mental health and food insecurity and how that impacts the whole person.
And with food, like one of our principals told us this week that at several of the families, they haven't seen them except on the days that food literacy is doing our meal kit distribution at their school. There's something about that joy and that connection that these families aren't showing up for anything else that's happening, but they'll come out for a Food Literacy Center recipe kit, right? And the kids do come. They'll be in the back seats of the cars. Sometimes they'll ride their bikes with their siblings, and they get really excited. I've seen them, they'll take the kit, and then they'll go sometimes to like a grassy spot in the parking lot or the school front lawn, and they'll sit down with them. And, these are raw ingredients, and the kids will be flipping through the boxes. We have little activity sheets and crayons, but there's something about this that is different for them, that is inviting them to show up in ways that they aren't engaging otherwise with their schools. So that's really powerful to me. And I'm grateful that we have been able to continue to offer that.
No, it's interesting. As soon as you said that, I immediately thought of like this, kind of formulate this picture in my head. And one of the reasons that I enjoy working with your organization so much is that you are so community-based and involved and entrenched in, I mean, you've touched on it, but I do want to really like tease out, like, how are these programs, like the community programs, and, if you want to talk about and touch on the new cooking school, how is that helping kids build that resilience and build that extra layer of confidence and joy and can do? How is that kind of working together?
Yeah, there's so much packed into there too. One is the type of hands-on education, and the other is the accessibility of it. And that's intentional for us. We have sort of 3 rules about all the things that we pack into our curriculum. It has to be fun, it has to be approachable, and I'm blanking on the third, but that accessibility, that approachability is one of these pillars for us, because we understand that we're working with kids who likely have met a lot of educational barriers. We have a lot of kids that, for example, might have ADHD or other learning challenges. And so this hands-on approach is actually like, there's all kinds of studies showing that kids are more likely to retain what they've learned in the sciences and math, all these STEM curriculum, if they're learning it hands-on. Like, think about math. You're, finding a quarter cup measuring cup suddenly, and you're seeing it stacked next to the half cup and the cup, and suddenly math makes sense other than just numbers on a page, right? So you're talking about science and you're saying, okay, we're going to make an emulsion. We're kindergartners and we're going to do a science experiment to make a salad dressing, and you can see the oil and the vinegar not mixed, and then you shake and you see them blend, right? Like, this is the stuff that sticks and makes these really difficult subjects approachable for our kids. So that's part of it. And what was the other part of your question? You had a lot packed in there.
Sorry about that. No, I wanted to discuss like how it builds resilience in children and in youth to be able to do community programs. And then if you wanted to also like talk about your new cooking school as well, and how that's helping to keep the kids in our community engaged and resilient, especially during COVID.
Sure. So back to the resilience of, so say you weren't successful in your math class, and then suddenly you're in food literacy cooking class and it starts to make sense. Or say you're English as a second language learner, and we've handed you a recipe in both English and on the backside Spanish or Hmong, and suddenly you recognize yourself in the cooking, you recognize your grandma in the food, and maybe in your classroom, in your regular school day, you didn't feel present, you didn't feel connected, and suddenly you do. You're hearing words that are familiar to you, and not just familiar, but spark joy, right? And so it helps you be present, it helps you to be successful, right? And many of our kids don't experience these kinds of success in their typical traditional classroom. So offering this allows these kids to feel these moments of success, and that builds resilience, right? Like, I can see myself as a success now, and maybe I didn't before. So there's so much packed into it. And seeing my culture, right? Hearing my language, all of these things make you matter. And that is so important, and that is missing in so many areas of our world. So we try to really intentionally build all of that in. And then the new cooking school. So we are building this on a vacant lot that is right across the street from public housing, where the average annual income of these families is $8,000 a year. That is not a typo. You did not mishear that. $8,000 for a household in California. So that's the level of poverty that we are facing. And there's so many things packed into that, right? You look at this big word, social determinants of health, which means basically, what are all the barriers to being healthy that exists in your neighborhood? So this neighborhood also is like right on the freeway. And there's all kinds of studies showing that when you have that kind of freeway noise, your brain is always in fight or flight. And there are studies showing that you will have kids' test scores lower near freeways because of that noise. And it's distracting your brain. And then also you add hunger, then you can't focus in class. Your brain's already distracted. Now you're hungry too. Just all these barriers for these kids that we won't find in other zip codes. Not having sidewalks. So you can't get out and run off, burn steam, right? You can't get out and take a walk. There's all kinds of studies showing how nature impacts our brains and how nature can help ground you. So, every element of the way neighborhoods are built affects our health and affects like how long we'll actually live. And so building this cooking school on a vacant lot right across from public housing, I really wanted to be conscientious of what are the needs of our kids. Like, yes, we need some food there. We want to grow food, but they also need nature and they need nature sounds. So we're going to have water features, right, to combat that traffic. We're going to have a running path where kids can just flat out sprint, right? Because there's going to be those kids who just need that release. And then we're going to have, places where they can climb or play or just sit under a tree and just be, right? So the hope is that it's healing in many ways, as well as bringing that nourishment and that food. So there's just so many layers. Yeah.
That sounds so amazing. It's interesting because, as you were sharing this information about the school, it made me think of, oh man, and I know the acronym, but I feel like I'm gonna mess up some of it, but I think it's like Stott, right? It's like a grounding mindfulness where you just take a moment and you process how you're feeling and you ground yourself in what are you smelling, what are you touching, what are you hearing, what are you tasting, so that it gives your body a moment to settle in. And as a person, as an anxious person myself, there are definitely moments where I have to take a moment and stop and say okay, I can feel the wind on me. I can taste this, delicious piece of food. I can hear the birds or my dog barking. And so you're right. All of that plays a part, especially, if that's positively impacting my brain and my, general system as an adult, it's going to do wonders, with a bunch of other things in play as well. But it'll definitely do wonders for youth and for children that are able to kind of at least take a small moment and just stop and be able to, like you said, hear these water features and be able to have somewhere to get their energy out to express themselves. It sounds really great, Amber. That's really awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's important to remember that, we're not just looking at hunger, because we can't just fix that, right? And if all we're doing is supplying food, we are not looking at our kids as whole humans, and we have to be looking at their health very holistically so that we can be helping them build this long-term resilience and helping improve their whole health. Yeah, absolutely.
On a basic level, hungry children can't learn. Evidence shows that proper nutrition helps with development, behavior, ability to learn. It's just, that's the entry point. And then you're talking about, once we've gotten past, is this child hungry? We can focus on pulling out the other aspects that are important to create a whole person, to focus on their mental health, to focus on creativity, their ability to take in information and learn and prosper throughout their life. So it starts with hunger, but I love your full person approach on how to deal with the situation.
Yeah, because there isn't a hierarchy of need in that, right? Yes, a child, that child is experiencing all those things simultaneously. And we could put food in their belly, but they're still anxious, or they're still, feeling some scared or whatever else they are experiencing. And so being able to say, I've got you, right? Here's a soft place to land. It really will help them long term, and that's the goal. Yeah.
Well, I know that we're going to, start to wrap up, but I would love to hear from both, Tiffany and Amber. How do we take action? What are suggestions or tips or next steps, or, if we think about legislatively in this year that we have, and, advocacy work as well? I'd love to hear from you two about what are next steps and actual items for people who are listening or, watching this and taking this all in. How can they be a benefit to children, youth, families, and food in their local communities?
Absolutely. There's lots of legislative and advocacy action items that are going to be happening this year. If you go to nextgenpolicy.org, you can sign up for alerts on how to get engaged, but specifically, there's one bill that comes to mind Senate Budget Chair Nancy Skinner just introduced Healthy School Meals for All. That's SB 364. It would establish a free school meal program for all children in California, so breakfast and lunch. And it would also focus on promoting access to healthy, freshly prepared food from California farmers, so stimulating our own economy. And it's just, I think the senator said something along the lines of like, school meals is just a part of nutrition. It's like the same, you need it the same way that you need a textbook. And having that will help you be able to focus on the whole person. If you don't have to worry about hunger in the first place, you can then go on to focus on all the other important aspects of learning at school. If we are able to pass this bill, it would be the first state in the nation to provide free school meals for all children. And it would reduce a lot of the stigma associated with free and reduced price meals. A lot of kids feel ashamed that they're a part of that program and they skip their meals altogether. And that can be like their only source of nutrition sometimes. So it's really important legislation that we're working on. The California Association of Food Banks, they're a great organization where you can go to their website and find your local food bank where you can either volunteer or find food resources yourself. Those are the couple of things that come to mind right now. Amber, what about you?
Yeah, I would echo the free universal meals. So important, so critical, because it allows us to not only reach more children, because, if you're not hitting that free or reduced threshold, but still food is a struggle in your family budget, this allows you to have a higher quality. Because if we're feeding all the kids, then school meals are also going to have a better budget, right? And that helps small farmers. I mean, it's just the layers. Again, you can't unpack any of these issues from one another, right? So when you're helping kids, you're helping the planet, you're helping the economy. It all goes hand in hand. So I definitely echo that. And then I think the most important thing, and I think we're seeing it begin to happen in COVID, is we have got to, as a society, start educating ourselves better about these issues. Just listening to this conversation, I hope, will help people to better understand these issues. But I see a lot of fatigue of, well, I understand hunger, so I'm going to do something about it and go about my day. And I know people are tired. I know that this is hard to consume in terms of the information, but we need an informed consumer base in America, because we cannot move the dial otherwise if we're simplifying all of these issues to the most basic level of them. So I just hope that people will continue to listen and learn.
Absolutely. Hearing the work that my colleague, here at Next is working on, and what you, Amber, are working on, I hope that people do take away that, it takes more than just saying like, okay, this is a thing and I'm acknowledging it. It's much more of so you've acknowledged it, great. How are we going to do the work now? What are the next steps that we're going to take? How do we step up and take care of our kids and as a community at large? So yeah, no, these are all really great things that we are going to keep an eye out and hopefully be engaged with. I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for taking time to have this conversation. I know that I've gotten a lot out of it, and to be able to have this type of conversation and to, even begin to break down, how do we have a whole child? How do we engage with children in food and their health, and the acknowledgement that like mental health and behavioral health is just as important as physical health, and how do we bridge that gap in that conversation? And I'm just really thrilled that we were able to take the time and have this conversation. So thank you so much to both of you.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Thank you, Courtnie, for bringing us together today.
Of course. Thank you.